You can attribute it to a war for resources. That's what the, I would say, wretchedly simple-minded economists presume. People fight over scarce resources. It's like, hey, we're a little bit more sophisticated than that. And first of all, what resources are you talking about? The bloody Inuit had nothing. They lived perfectly well. What did they have? Snow and seal blubber. You know, people can live in unbelievably deprived conditions. And so the idea that there are natural resources that we fight over because there's a shortage of them is a pretty oversimplified view of human beings. It's like, well, why do people fight? Well, maybe they fight sometimes for good reasons, but very, very frequently they fight for bad reasons. And those bad reasons are personal as well as sociocultural and economic. You know, if you were a Nazi prison guard, for example, whatever pathologies you were carrying around in your destructive little soul, whatever element of Cain was deeply embedded in you, had the opportunity to be manifest fully at every moment of your waking existence, right? You had these people who were completely beholden to you, with no rights whatsoever, to whom you could do whatever your evil little heart determined. You think, well, maybe that was a motivation for putting them there to begin with. And all the cover story about, well, we're trying to build the Third Reich and we're trying to stabilize the state and we're trying to do all these good things. Maybe that's just a cover story for the real motivation, which is nothing but what? The construction of death camps that killed 6 million people. How about that? And the obliteration of 120 million people on the planet, and the leaving of Europe in ruins. Maybe that was the motivation. Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior. Let's take a break for 15 minutes. So, okay, so the next thing that happens, these stories were sewed together, right, to make something that resembles a coherent text. And there's this literary technique known as metonymy. And metonymy is the juxtaposition of two things beside one another, with the implication that because they're juxtaposed, they're related in some important manner to one another. And so the stories are sequenced, and there's an implicit, the stories are sequenced in a particular manner, and you might operate under the assumption that that sequencing occurred because the sequencer, who was an editor or a group of editors, they call that person the redactor, but they have no idea if it was one person or many people who organized these texts into something resembling a coherent story. So imagine the stories evolved somewhat independently, and then they were organized so that they produced what approximated a coherent narrative. It's not entirely coherent because there are paradoxical claims, say at the level of the sentence. So for example, the creation order in the first story in Genesis isn't exactly the same as the creation order in the second story. And you know, people who insist upon the literal truth of the Bible, whatever that means, are bothered by those contradictions and turn themselves into knots trying to iron them out. And fair enough, right? Because you want the story to be coherent. But you know, that's sort of, it's important, but it's also beside the point. You don't want to focus on one level of analysis at the exclusion of all the other levels of analysis. That's probably the right way to think about it. Now, the fact that these stories are sequenced in a particular manner and that kind of makes sense implies that there's some sort of narrative coherence underneath driving them forward. Otherwise, they would be nothing but a random assemblage of stories, and they're by no means random, that's for sure. They're selected and edited and put together in a particular manner and then stored that way and dealt with in a particular manner by thousands of people over many, many years. What happens after Cain and Abel is, well, there's an interlude, which is this interlude, and it's kind of a bridge, and there's a lot packed into it too, although I'm not going to take it apart very much. It says, so this is after the Cain and Abel story. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and then took them wives of all which they chose. And there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which are of old, men of renown. Okay, so I already pointed out that if you go back just a little bit, you see that the descendants of Cain are represented as founders of institutions, right? There are Enoch, who builds a city, and Ada, or Jabal, who is the father of those who dwell in tents and of those who own cattle, and then there's Jubal, who's the father of all that are musicians, and so on. So one of the things that you see in myths very frequently is that if there's a pattern of behavior that's characteristic of the culture, that pattern of behavior is attributed to a hero who was in the past, who was the first person who did that. And so you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means in part that there was a first person who did that, although more likely there was an assemblage of people who aggregated that particular ability, say the ability to play music, across a very large amount of time. But these are pre-literate people, right? And they're trying to remember the past. And so what happens, Mircea Eliade had documented this quite well, is that that aggregation of people gets collapsed into a single meta person, and that's the hero of old. And so, we already talked about how this works, is that, you know, there are admirable people, and then you can tell a story about an admirable person, and then you can extract a story out of the set of admirable people, and you keep building higher and higher order admirable people until you extract out at the top what's ultimately admirable. And this is actually an indication of that process occurring. The giants that are being referred to in this particular phrase are the heroes of the past who established the traditions on which the society exists. And so that's all compacted into this little paragraph. And so this little paragraph here. There were giants in the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Well, you could hardly say, I think there's very little difference between what I just told you and what this story says. I mean, it says it as if it was something that literally occurred, but in some sense, it doesn't exactly say that. It says, well, the ancient landscape was a landscape of heroic adventurers. It's like, well, we do that to our own history, right? I mean, even when we consider it literal history, we don't pick people at random to historicize. We pick people who had some substantive impact and tell stories about them. And they're emblematic in some sense of the spirit of striving that characterizes humanity. And so you can't have history without some mythologization, because the mythologization occurs at the level of the selection of the entities about which you're going to weave the historical tale. So, okay, so anyway, so there's a little interlude there that talks about the appearance of heroes in the past, but then that's just done with very, very rapidly. And then we move into another story. This is the story of Noah. So the way it looks to me is that the part of Genesis that I'm going to talk to you about ends with the flood myth and also with the Tower of Babel. And so the flood myth is the demolition of everything that came before, and the Tower of Babel in some sense is exactly the same thing. So there's two chaotic, I mean, it's like the fall occurs in stages. There's paradise, and then Adam and Eve fall into culture, and then Cain and Abel. Cain falls into chaos, and then the entire society falls into chaos. And the flood comes, and the Tower of Babel is produced, and then that's the end of the truly archaic parts of the Bible. And so what that seems to me, what's happening, it's very sophisticated, is that there's an implicit causal narrative being woven about the manner in which Cain responds, and the probability that human beings are going to deteriorate and the flood is going to come. So, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him at his heart. Well, we already encountered a story like that once already, right? That happened in the Marduk story, where Tiamat and Apsu give rise to the elder gods. And they kill Apsu, which was not a very smart idea, right? They demolish the substructure of their stable society. And of course, chaos comes flooding back. Well, what does it mean to say that human beings, to say that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually is not much different than to say that people are acting in a manner that demolishes the cultural structure. Now, we've already even pointed out that the cultural structure that happens in this story was produced by the heroic giants of the past, right? And we've also noted that what Cain is objecting to in his Cain-like manner is the social structure, which isn't rewarding him properly, and the transcendence that's above that, and the spirit of Logos itself. He's rejecting all that. Okay, so the issue here is that when that sort of evil is produced, exactly as when Apsu is slayed, I guess that's right, by the elder gods, then all hell breaks loose, all chaos comes back. Now Tiamat, if you remember correctly, is the god of the salt water, goddess of the salt water. And so the return of Tiamat and the flood are mythologically similar ideas. Now Eliade has taken apart flood myths from all over the world, and he made two brilliant comments about them. And they're also akin to some degree to what you can see in the Egyptian story about Seth and the corruption of the state. So, because the Egyptians figured out that there's always a power working within the state, let's say, that corrupted it. Now, that was Seth, and that was always working for its overthrow. It's an idea like Satan, and I said that the word Seth becomes the word Satan through Coptic Christianity. So the Iliad's idea was this, that things fall apart of their own accord merely because they age. That's the first motif in the flood story. And that's only to say that if you build something, it decays. If you build something and you just leave it the hell alone, it will soon not work, right? And that's entropy. So one of the reasons that the flood always threatens is merely because of entropy. And you see that reflected in the Egyptian story, because one of the reasons that Osiris falls prey to Seth is because he's old. You know, he was a great hero when he was young and created the Egyptian state, like the men of renown. But now he's old, and it's worse, he's willfully blind, but that's the next thing. But the fact that he's old is just a start. Things fall apart of their own accord. So once something is given to you, you have to maintain it just to ensure its continued existence. And so you actually have a contract with most of the things that you own. It's like a moral contract. Let's say you have a car. Well, you've decided that you're going to sacrifice to have the car. And so you've performed an ethical calculation. But the car was only worth the sacrifice as long as it functions as a car. And so what that means is that to justify the sacrifice you made to have the car, you have to maintain the car. Because otherwise, you're acting out the proposition that the thing you sacrificed for actually didn't have any value, and so you're obliterating that as a useful contract. And you run into the situation where the car will just deteriorate of its own accord, and then you won't have a car at all. Well, so let's say, how do you speed the process by which your car deteriorates? Well, that's easy. You're driving it along the road and it starts to make a ticking noise. Tick, 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 tick. And you think, I should go have that ticking noise checked because you've heard it. And then you think, no, it won't matter. It's like, yeah, probably it'll matter. And what does matter mean? Well, matter is mother. That's chaos too, you know, matter. But what it means is that that little ticking noise is the birthplace of Tiamat in your car. That's a good way of thinking about it, is that it's your first indication that the dragon of chaos is going to manifest itself in your car. That happens when I've got a funny story about that. So I had a friend in graduate school, someone I really liked, but I wouldn't call her mechanically inclined, let's put it that way. And she had an old Honda, and those things were notorious for rusting out. This is 30 years ago when they were first produced. They weren't adapted well to Canadian winters. And we used to go in her car, in her Honda, and it got a little on the scary side because it was so rusty underneath that you could actually see through the floorboards. And that actually made me nervous, because if you can see through the floorboards, that means that they're not really floorboards. What they are is like rust. And so I mentioned the fact that that might be a problem to her a couple of times, but she was sort of blithe about it. And one day she was driving down St. Lawrence Street in Montreal, which is the main street running roughly north and south, and her hood popped up. It bent and popped up spontaneously. And so she was really curious about that. And so she was with this friend of hers who was just as clueless mechanically as she was, which is really quite remarkably clueless. And so they pulled off into a service station and had the guy come out and look at it. And well, he opened the hood, obviously. And what had happened was the body had fallen off the frame. So, and what had happened was the shock, which is like supposed to be attached to the car, had pushed up through the through the hood. So literally the car body had like fallen onto the ground, but she managed to drive the car.